Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in this wonderful, extraordinary world of ours. I truly hope you are safe, sound, and above all, healthy. I'm Aaron David Miller, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and welcome to Carnegie Connects, a series of conversations on issues of critical importance to America and to the world. Today, we're talking Saudi Arabia as we await the visit tomorrow of Muhammed bin Salman, aka MBS, to Washington, 40-year-old crown prince and putative king. Before I introduce my guest, I just want to identify one issue of interest to me, and that's this. MBS is going to be set apart, I suspect, from all of his predecessors in one extraordinary regard. Saudis have had, by my count, 7 kings. Actually, the first book I ever wrote that traced the relationship between Saudi's first king, Abdulaziz ibn Saud, founder of the modern kingdom. He ruled for 21 years. King Fahd, I think, ruled for 23. The average length of a Saudi king ruling in Saudi is roughly 13 years. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, could actually rule the kingdom for more than half a century. He could see 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 American presidents come and go during his tenure. This temporal reality, I think, is worth noting. How it shapes his own view as he sees the world, unclear, or even whether it shapes his view. But it is a reality that I think American policymakers and those following Saudi Arabia need to bear in mind. So today we're going to explore with 2 extraordinary guests 3 basic questions. What does MBS want for Saudi Arabia? What does he want from the visit? And what do we want? What does the U.S. want, the Trump administration, from MBS in Saudi Arabia? To help us unpack all of this, as I mentioned, we have 2 extraordinary guests. Bernard Haykel is a scholar of the Arabian Peninsula, focusing on the politics, economics, and history of the Gulf cooperation countries and Yemen. He's a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, where he teaches courses on energy, history, and politics. He earned his doctorate in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford and is now preparing a book. Can't wait to read it, on the modern history of Saudi Arabia. Michael Ratney, a colleague of mine for a very long time, served for over 3 decades as a distinguished U.S. diplomat, most recently as U.S. ambassador to Saudi. Michael served as the U.S. Consul General in Jerusalem, as the charge d'affaires of the U.S. Embassy in Israel, as well as postings in Baghdad, Beirut, Casablanca, Doha, Mexico City, Tunis, Bridgetown, and of course, the strangest capital of all, Washington, D.C. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. It's great that you're here. So let's pose the first question. I think, Bernie, to you, what does MBS want for Saudi Arabia? You wrote, I think, in Foreign Affairs last year that his real objective is to make Saudi Arabia, as you put it, quote unquote, normal. By this, you meant a society that's socially open and economically dynamic, one that would be firmly under his authoritarian grip. People would be free to remain pious, but they couldn't impose their religions or orthodoxy on others. The government would not interfere in the daily habits of its subjects. Men and women would dress as they please, public and mingle without being harassed. Essentially, a relaxation of change of much of what Saudi Arabia had traditionally been. Can you expand on what normal in that sense means? Have I captured your words correctly?
Yeah, I mean, first, let me just thank you for this opportunity. Look, what you described, and you accurately quoted me, is just only one aspect of what he wants. I mean, what he really wants, on the one hand, is what every Saudi king has always wanted, which is a very strong strategic alliance with the United States that will provide security for the kingdom, because the kingdom lives in an extremely hostile and unstable region with neighbors, in particular Iran, but also at one point Iraq, that see Saudi as a very rich and relatively weak country militarily, and so therefore they have ambitions for all kinds of nuisance for the kingdom. So on the one hand, he wants security, which is a constant in Saudi Arabia's thinking. And the other is that he wants to be able to transition his country and his economy away from dependence on oil to a diversified production economy. And for that, he needs the country to become normal. In other words, a country where you have economic dynamism, entrepreneurship, a kind of a socially liberal environment where people can be creative and productive and generate wealth that's not related to either oil and gas or petrochemicals.
Yeah. Michael, you spent 23 to 25 in Saudi as U.S. ambassador. You had a piece in the New York Times today, which I would suggest everyone read. And I think my main takeaway, your main conceit is that you believe strongly that what MBS is interested in most of all is domestic issues, how to strengthen the kingdom. And he's grown increasingly frustrated with conflicts that he believes are going to continue over time and wants to somehow disentangle himself. Am I reading you correctly on this?
Yeah, that's right. I think he has two major focuses. One is developing his society and his economy, as Bernie said, creating an economy that can thrive and survive in a post-fossil fuel era. And from a foreign policy perspective, protecting that transformation and that investment. So looking at kind of Saudi Arabia's national security and regional security partnerships through the lens of how do we protect Saudi Arabia from all of these conflicts and turbulence in the region. And that really is his principal focus. A domestic economy, a domestic societal transformation, and looking at his region through the lens of keeping all of these conflicts away from what he's trying to accomplish inside.
Right. I mean, to quote Tip O'Neill, if you're correct, all politics are local. And I want to put this one in the pocket and come back to it when we talk about MBS in Washington. How does that domestic focus and his interest in disentangling himself from these conflicts, whether that's a fair characterization or trying to manage them without exposing Saudi Arabia, because there's a lot going on. There's huge expectations for what MBS should do in the mind of this administration, and maybe even some of its predecessors. But I want to come back to this. I do want to get both of you to address the issue of whether or not, as you've watched MBS as crown prince, why I don't know how the Arabic of crown prince translates. There is no crown in Saudi Arabia, and yet I gather that phrase basically means successor. But he's functioned essentially as king, even though he's crown prince, and he's had a determinative impact on Saudi policy even before becoming king. How has he changed the sort of risk readiness, some would call it, recklessness of his earlier years, 2017 to 2020, the boycott of Qatar, the disastrous war in Yemen, the hostility with Iran, all of that seems to be now diffusing. Is he growing in the job, Bernie?
Yeah, I mean, he effectively, came to power with his father in 2015. So the war in Yemen was started then. It was also based on intelligence that he received that the Houthis were basically forming a militia that on his border, and that they were going to be like a Hezbollah to Saudi, as Hezbollah is to Israel. And he wanted to stop that. I think definitely he has matured. He has learned from his mistakes. I mean, thank God for that. It would be a real problem if he didn't learn from his mistakes. And that he has tried to achieve the same things, but through different means. And his advisors have also changed over time. And he is, what I particularly find useful and for American interests in him is that he's very transparent. Like, what he wants is pretty clear, and it's not rooted in some sort of pan-Islamic or Arab nationalist ideology or some revolutionary ideology. He wants stability, order, economic liberalism, capitalism, and American domination of the region. I mean, in terms of its security infrastructure, those are things that are fairly clear and obvious in what he wants.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's kind of easy to deal with him.
Mike, how do you see the the sort of, maybe I'm categorizing this too simply, the sort of transition from a risk readiness abroad beyond Saudi Arabia to a sort of risk aversion. I mean, all the three, I mean, he's cut a deal with the Houthis. In March of 23, he's de-escalated and have what, I mean, I think the word is détente, a relaxation of tensions with Iran. That may be a strategic move on his part. I don't know. They dropped the boycott of Qatar, even though I suspect tensions remain. What does that tell you? Does it get back to your point that domestic priorities require a more stable, consistent set of friendlier relationships with Saudi's regional neighbors?
You know, Aaron, sort of at the risk of oversimplification, I think he developed a kind of hyper-realist sense when it comes to foreign policy. He looks around him at these conflicts and he just doesn't think they're resolvable. He doesn't think the Iranian ideology is going to change, except maybe in a generation or more. He doesn't think the Houthis are going to change their approach. He doesn't think the sort of the tendency towards violence in a lot of parts of the region can be affected. All you can do is keep it as far away from his shores as possible. You know, I think he wishes he could solve some of these things, but he tried to some degree. He's seen us and others do it. And I think he says, if they're going to effect a major transformation within their own country, one thing they have to do is just keep these conflicts as far away as possible. So he has this sort of hyper-realism when it comes to foreign policy. And this isn't kind of an imperfect way of thinking about it, but domestically, he's become something of an idealist. He wants his population educated and fully employed and based in technology and moving away from dependence on fossil fuels and a lively arts and culture scene. Again, imperfect because it's an imperfect society and they do have continued problems. But this contrast I find interesting between what he's trying to develop domestically and his sort of dark views about what's all around him.
Right. So let me press you on the issue of these dark views. You know, geography is destiny, frankly. And in the Middle East, proximity is largely a matter of vulnerability. Can he afford to disengage and disentangle himself? No Saudi king can ignore Yemen. Clearly, and you know, in March of 2022, am I correct? The Houthis launched a strike at an airport, I think in Jeddah, or an oil-producing facilities. And the Iranians cruise missiles again, September 2019, against Abqaiq and Khurais. Can he afford to sort of disengage rather than try to manage? And then if he can't, and it's a fascinating proposition that you put on the table, of a disengaged Saudi Arabia, unwilling and or unable, and we're about to transition once we talk a little bit about human rights to his visit here tomorrow. Can Saudi Arabia afford this?
I mean, I wouldn't use the word disengage. Certainly his objective is de-escalation. I think they're using their tools of statecraft differently than maybe when MBS first became defense minister and then first became crown prince, where there was this sense of projecting power in order to influence and affect the region. I think now they use their influence and their tools of diplomacy and others, including humanitarian aid and so forth, as a way to de-escalate the conflicts. You know, look at Yemen, for example. You know, they were involved in coalition military campaign against the Houthis. The U.S. was supporting it for a while. It didn't work. Got a kind of crossways with the United States, given all the civilian casualties. Eventually transitioned not to a military campaign, but to a diplomatic effort directly with the Houthis, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe once you could have called it reckless. I think trying to talk directly to the belligerents in order to de-escalate the conflict seems anything but reckless. Shortly after I got to Saudi in 23 is when the war in Sudan broke out. The Saudis regard Sudan as their neighbor. Like, make no mistake, there's a lot of Sudanese in Saudi Arabia. There's a lot of potential for turbulence and conflict literally just across the Red Sea. And they embarked on an exercise with the United States to try to reach a ceasefire.
Yeah.
I don't think they had any expectation that the underlying problems of the conflict could be solved in the near term, but they just wanted the war to stop. And they wanted those who were kind of fueling that war to stop doing so.
Yeah.
Syria is another example. You know, they were once with us, kind of supporting the opposition in a way
Yep.
that arguably kind of perpetuated the war and the misery of the Syrian people and stoked radicalization, drew Hezbollahis and jihadis closer to the region. At some point, they said, we just need to stop this, and we need to find a way just to de-escalate these conflicts. And if in the long run there's a way to resolve them, great. But for the moment, just keep them as far away from Saudi as possible.
May I just add one sentence?
Yeah, I
I
was
mean,
gonna ask.
one way to think about this, and just one sentence, one way to think about this is that while Saudi Arabia cannot solve, the conflict in Yemen or the conflict with Iran or the conflict in Palestine or that in Sudan, I can't imagine a solution without them being involved. In other words, you cannot get to a solution if there is one without them.
Right. It is interesting that Ahmed Shara, I think's first foreign visit was to Saudi, and maybe the Saudis have figured out that they're going to have to accept a sort of imperfect ending or outcome, or how Syria is going to end up is unclear. I had Gaza in mind, of course, and normalization with Israel with respect to disengagement. I won't use that word disengagement, or perhaps a more realist view about what's possible in terms of solving these problems. We're going to come back to that. I do want to talk for a bit before we get on to MBS visit on human rights. I'll be very clear here. I mean, Jamal Khashoggi was a friend of mine. He was a friend of many people. When I was at the Wilson Center, he was to come as a journalist. He was murdered. CIA's intel, medium to high confidence, that the Crown Prince enabled, organized, acquiesced in the plan to kill him. I want to ask you both. The argument that I've heard is that in order to transform, and let's be clear, however this ends up, MBS strikes me, given the changes that he's affected in Saudi Arabia, he may belong in the category. We'll see how it all plays out as a transformative leader. There aren't many of those around in the Middle East. So the argument is, in order to transform, he needed to repress. That the authoritarianism, the absence of free speech, whole list of horrid human rights abuses that the regime presides over against its population, dissidents, was absolutely necessary in order to effect this transformation. You got 11 human rights groups issuing a statement, including Freedom House, Human Rights Watch, Dawn. The administration needs to understand these human rights abuses, and it has to become a part of American policy. But I just wondered on the issue of the transformative leader must repress, must squash all dissent in order things have to get bad before they can get better. So I guess that's my question to both of you. Does that hold up? Is that why Saudi human rights record is as bad as it is in terms of its whatever improvements that have been made? Michael, let me start with you.
Yeah, it's a complicated question. And I think one thing I would say is, like, when you live in Saudi Arabia, it doesn't feel like a repressive society. And I know that's the impression people have on the outside. But I can tell you, when you're living there and you're talking to Saudis, especially Saudis that have never sort of experienced the sort of cultural openness that they're living with right now, it just doesn't feel like a repressive society. That said, there is this kind of contrast between this extraordinary explosion of creative expression on the one hand, but a complete absence of political expression on the other. And I think that's something that, for the moment, Saudis generally live with. I think partly because Saudis are, many of them, overjoyed at the fact that they can live increasingly normal lives, and they don't really want to do anything to mess that up. I think they probably cut their leadership a certain amount of slack in that regard, because I think they recognize that the speed of the changes inside of Saudi Arabia probably necessitate, again, without justifying it, I think it probably explains it. He doesn't feel like it can get out of control. If there's people who are opposed to the sorts of reforms, including reforms that we applaud, like bringing women into the workforce and into society. There's probably forces within the country that are opposed to that. There's conservative religious forces that are opposed to some of these changes. And I think from the MBS perspective, he doesn't want to let that genie out of the bottle. And I think there's quite a few Saudis that sort of understand that perspective and would rather things continue improving on the trajectory that they have rather than let things descend into chaos.
You mean evolutionary progression rather than some dramatic revolutionary opening up, for example?
I mean, I suppose, but I got to say, the speed with which the changes that have happened thus far have taken place is hardly evolutionary.
Yeah.
Right. It's happened over the course of 6 or 7 or 8 years, changes that are usually generational if they ever occur in a lot of other countries. I would talk to Saudi women who were describing their experiences. You'd swear they were talking about their grandmother's experiences a generation ago. They're talking about their own experiences 5 or 6 years ago. So I think it's wrong to call it evolutionary. I think, it's fair to say that the Saudi leadership feels like they have kind of certain room for maneuver. And if they're going to make these changes, and I think MBS feels an urgency in making them. He feels like he doesn't know when this energy transition is going to come. He doesn't know what other forces are going to raid against him in the region. He wants to get this transition cemented. And I think he probably doesn't feel like he has a lot of room for maneuver if things get out of control in terms of dissent.
Bernie, do you have a thought or two on this?
Yeah, I mean, look, every authoritarian is going to say when they're consolidating power that they need to repress in order to effect change and to reform their society. And, there's some truth to that. South Korea was not a democracy, and Singapore was not a democracy. Some might even argue it's still not a democracy today, and Lee Kuan Yew was repressive. So, and I think the challenge for us as Americans is to try to convince someone like MBS that the trajectory of Saudi Arabia ought to look more like South Korea than, say, China, than the Communist Party regime in China, and that ultimately political repression of political dissent is not good for business. It's not good for attracting foreign direct investment. It's not good for your image if you're a tourism destination. In other words, you're not China. You ought to be more like us. And that's going to take time. And it's a society that, after all, it's not Denmark and it's not Sweden. It has its own political culture, its own history, its own, tradition it was never colonized. It has a very strong authoritarian, tradition within the Islamic tradition. And MBS doesn't claim to be a Democrat.
It's also, you're right. No, I understand. It's also unlike South Korea. South Korea is China and North Korean neighbors, but they also have Japan. MBS's authoritarianism is happening in the context of a region inhabited by authoritarians.
That's right. And also, if you benchmark him,
that has to be kept in mind.
Yeah, and if you benchmark him, with Assad or with Saddam Hussein or with President Sisi, as Michael said, Saudi doesn't feel like a repressive place when you live there. And I've lived under the Syrian boot when I was in Lebanon growing up. Yeah. Believe me, I know what repression feels like, and it doesn't feel like that in Saudi at all.
One last question on this. John McCain, I argued with him about this, not because I disagreed, because I really believe that U.S. foreign policy has never prioritized human rights values or democratic reform. It's never made it the central preoccupation of its policy. McCain argued that our values are our interests and our interests are our values. And you needed to understand that, and U.S. policy needed to reflect that. No administration I ever worked for, from Jimmy Carter to Bush 43, ever made human rights the centerpiece of its policies. And when you look at the way various administrations have reacted to MBS, Biden came out strongly, claimed he was socially irredeemable, talked about Saudi autocracy. And then by the end of the Biden administration, you had quite a different view of Saudi Arabia. And Trump administration basically feels much more comfortable with authoritarians and autocrats, Xi, Putin, Erdogan, and MBS. So last question, because we have to spend the next 20 minutes on the visit. How should human rights in Saudi Arabia factor into U.S. foreign policy? I doubt if there'll be any discussion of it during this visit. Is it just performative? How do we look at this, and what do we do? Michael, you've wrestled with this in various circumstances over the years. So have I. What is it a priority? Should it be?
So first of all, I think you're right. I don't expect it to figure prominently in this visit to Washington by the Saudi Crown Prince, and I don't think it's a centerpiece of Trump's foreign policy generally. I would say to take human rights, lump all dimensions of it together, and sort of place it at the center of any relationship, it doesn't work. It doesn't work in almost any case, and I don't think it works in a case like Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the human rights picture is complicated. There's things that are dramatically better than they were even a few years ago. I mean, I think it's safe to say the role of women in society is something that it was the central piece of criticism from a human rights perspective of Saudi Arabia forever.
Yeah.
And now it's fundamentally different. There's other aspects of human rights that are better, and there's things, including judicial transparency and use of the death penalty. There's things that are lack of public expression, at least political expression. Like there's things that are problematic, but it doesn't really work to lump all of the things together, categorize Saudi Arabia as sort of irretrievably bad, and then say, okay, so we're going to go deal with some other country instead. Maybe better to say, well, there's things that are improving dramatically. We have fundamental national security interests in the country. Maybe there's a way to have a conversation about human rights, including through expressing the United States' own values through our behavior, and maintain a dialogue with them about the things where there are shortcomings.
Right.
That seems more productive than just kind of writing them off because it's easier as a matter of policy or because we all have short attention spans to lump every aspect of human rights in together.
Well, we don't write them off, though. I mean, there's no question about it.
No, but there's people that call for us to do that, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the strength, supposedly. Some would argue it a weakness about, functioning in democratic polity. Bernie, a comment before we move on?
Yeah, just very quickly. Firstly, the Biden administration in the last couple of years, and I think Michael can vouch to this, built much stronger institution-to-institution relations with the kingdom. And that is important. So moving away from the personalistic and the transactional to the more institutional, I think can help with the human rights situation. Second, I would say that, the Trump administration has been involved with specific individuals in cases of human rights abuses. And when it has been effective. And so these private conversations that can happen between the administration and the Saudis on individuals and nudging them privately rather than publicly, I think can be effective. Yeah. And lastly, the Saudis have about between 3,000 and 4,000 political rights prisoners at the moment. And they've released of the 4,000, let's say they're 4,000, they've released about 1,000 over the last year. And that's a very good thing. It's a very good vector, and it's one that should be encouraged. Again, probably more privately than publicly. And lastly, as I pointed out earlier, I think it's just good for business and for tourism and for foreign direct investment not to be a human rights abuser. And that should be reiterated again and again and again to them.
Yeah. Okay. The last two areas, MBS in Washington. I like to separate talking about a country's interests between the must-haves and the it would be nice to haves. What are, in your view, both of your views, Michael, you first, what are MBS's must-haves? If there are any, maybe they're not as formalized in this visit. What does he want?
I mean, I think the two big things he wants, one has to do with technology. I think he sees tech and AI kind of at the center of their economic transformation, and he wants that anchored in the United States and the U.S. tech industry. So I think what he wants, and I think this is probably the thing he wants the most out of this visit, is an agreement for regular, predictable, reliable supplies of the most advanced technology to fuel the artificial intelligence industry that he wants anchored back in the U.S. And that's been frustrating. It was frustrating for them and the Emirates and other countries in the Biden administration. And it's continued to take a lot of time to come up with some kind of a reliable mechanism in this administration. But I think that's number one. And I think number two is some kind of a defense agreement. He knows he's not going to get a treaty at this point because a treaty is tied to normalization, which is probably not on the table at the moment. But he wants something that will kind of cement the U.S. Saudi security partnership in a way that'll project to the region, to this region filled with conflict and instability, that there's a strong partnership that's going to protect the investment in this economic transition they're making.
Right. Bernie, to you, his one or two must-haves, or
well, I mean, let's just say that he has like a Christmas list, and then he has what he'll actually get. So
yeah, right.
The Christmas gift list would be a treaty, as Michael said. He's not going to get that. I think he wants U.S. Nuclear weapons based in Saudi Arabia as a form of deterrence against Iran. He's not likely to get that.
Weapons or the
actual weapons. Yeah, he actually wants
enrich uranium on Saudi.
No, he'll give up enrichment for nuclear weapons, but nuclear weapons that are managed by the U.S. So, like Germany, for instance, how we station nuclear weapons in Germany. So, he would love that. I don't think he'll get that.
That's extraordinary. That's what he really wants. That is an extraordinary thing.
Yeah, that's on the because it's the ultimate deterrence, right? So he would love, of course, the AI with chips, and that has real implications, because if we tie up with him on AI and on chips, it means he has to break his connection to the Chinese. Right. And that would be a major win for the United States and for U.S. tech. Yeah. So, and that's a shift, a major kind of strategic shift. Despite the fact that China is very important because it's his principal trading partner. Then he wants nuclear, civilian nuclear power generation. He wants mining and rare earths, agreements, and lots of other agreements on health, technology, and other things.
Right.
But he essentially what he really wants is he wants to be remembered not only as the great transformative leader of Saudi Arabia, but also the person who solidified once and for all a strong strategic alliance with the United States, that he delivered for Saudi, the US, like no other king before him has been able to deliver.
Yeah, that's a lift. That's a heavy lift. The last time we gave a defense commitment along the lines of Article 5 commitment was the 1960 revision of the U.S.-Japan Treaty. Yeah. Congress doesn't do this very often, right. Nor does administrations. And when they do it, it's done with Japan, it's done with NATO allies. We don't even have one with our close ally.
But maybe if you have a president who wants the Nobel Prize and he wants normalization with Israel, he might be able to pull it off. So we'll see.
I guess. F-35s. Somebody called me this morning, wanted to know a yes or no. Pentagon is past hurdles in the Pentagon. F-35 is the most sophisticated platform. We have various iterations of this aircraft. Will he get F-35s? We get a commitment from the White House. Wouldn't be delivered for several years, but would he get F-35s? The only regional party that has them are the Israelis. Again, NATO allies have them.
Should I go first?
Yes or no on F-35s?
Well, I think he will get the offer to buy F-35s. As to whether he wants them, I'm not sure. I suspect he does not want them.
Michael?
It's a curious thing, right? There's no easy yes or no answer. I think as Bernie said, it's true, right? He would like to be told that he can have them if he wants them.
Yes.
But it's also a little contrary to what their other objective, which is to develop their own defense industry. Like they were sort of done with buying expensive things from foreign countries. They want some of that to be produced domestically. And so F-35s is going back completely in the other direction, where they're just buying the most expensive plane they could possibly find and importing it. And they would have to import it with all of the contractors and everything else that goes with maintaining it. At the same time, where their big objective militarily is to develop their own capacity.
Right.
Not to mention the kill switch on the machine.
Yeah, well, it's the same logic they wanted in terms of the right to enrich as well. To black box it so it could be blown up if somehow they decided to nationalize their nuclear energy program. I wanted to ask you both on the issue of defense. I took a look at the language in the U.S.-Japan treaty, and I compared it with what the executive order said in the Qatar agreement. It's unbelievable. The language that this administration offered to the Qataris, I mean, it even goes beyond NATO Article 5. And it's remarkable. Now, you don't have the norms, the institutions, the sort of cultural affinity with NATO, which is why we call them NATO allies. But is something like the Qatari executive order, is that what they want, Michael?
I think they know that the Qatari executive order is just that. It's an executive order, and that means it theoretically could die with this administration, right? So it's very different from a treaty ratified by the Senate that endures. And I think what the Saudis want is a fundamental long-term security relationship with us. Whether they get offered that kind of executive order, I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me, but I think at heart what they want is something long-term and predictable. By the way, they also want long-term, predictable relationship when it comes to defense purchases, which they buy considerable amounts from the United States, and they're constantly frustrated that either because of bureaucratic problems or problems with our own industry or problems with Congress, they're prepared to pay. In some cases, they've already paid, and these things are held up. And I think if some kind of a defense agreement could help kind of stabilize that, I think that's something that they would want.
I mean, it's worth pointing out that the F-35 deal to the Emiratis fell through largely because of American security concerns about China and intelligence penetration. Raises the question too about whether MBS is pursuing he is pursuing a 360-degree foreign policy. I mean, he has got close relations with China, with Russia. All right, let's turn to.
Yeah, sorry, Aaron. He has close relations with those countries, but they're not intimate.
No, they're not, right.
The Chinese got a deal with the Houthis, and he's upset about that. And the Russians, he's also not. It's purely transactional on oil. So it's not these are not strategic relationships.
Right, and they're largely confined. I mean, the Chinese are never going to challenge the United States as the key security partner for Saudi Arabia. After all, it's CENTCOM and the U.S. Navy that protects Saudi exports to China, oil exports to China.
Correct. That's correct.
One of the many ironies of Middle Eastern politics. So let's turn to the issue that is on many people's minds: normalization with Israel. The Big Bang Agreement, Senate ratified treaty, access to high-end semiconductors, high tech, advanced U.S. weaponry in exchange for Saudi normalization with the Israelis, exchange of ambassadors, embassies, regional peace, regional integration. That big deal is clearly not around the corner. But I want to ask each of you, before October 7th and after October 7th, has the Saudi price for normalizing with Israel, and when I talk about normalization, I'm not talking about Egypt, Israel, because what the Emiratis and the Israelis have done in 4 years goes beyond what Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, who have formal treaties of peace, have done with one another in terms of warm peace. You can't even begin to compare the two. In terms of a warm peace, has the Saudi view changed on the issue of the Palestinians, or what is required now? Michael, first to you. You spent plenty of time in Jerusalem talking to Palestinians. You know this issue as well as anyone. Have the Saudi need, requirement, demand for what is required to normalize relationship with the Israelis? What is it, in your view?
So, they've been very public about it, particularly after October 7th. Now, I should say before October 7th, most of the negotiations were about what the United States and Saudi Arabia would do for each other. And we had only started to turn our attention to what Israel would do vis-a-vis the Palestinians. That was always going to be a part of it, despite some people's claims that the Saudis were ready to walk away from anything to do with the Palestinians. I don't think that was ever true. But our discussions had only begun to turn in earnest right around October 7th. And after October 7th, it became much more fraught for obvious reasons. I don't think the basic calculus for an agreement, that kind of the central piece, normalization between Saudi and Israel in exchange for mutual defense treaty between Saudi and the United States, I think that's still kind of strategically valid. But the Saudis have to be realistic, and MBS is realistic, right? This is happening in a climate in which the Saudis themselves, the Saudi citizens, are angry about what's going on in Gaza, the larger Arab Muslim world. And I think over the course of those months bleeding into years, the Saudis publicly carved out two basic conditions. One was an end to the war in Gaza, and that's subject to some measure of interpretation. I think what they mean is they need the IDF out of Gaza completely, no yellow line, no buffer zone, basically no airstrikes, the war is over. And they've used different terminology on this, they need a pathway to Palestinian statehood. And again, they've used multiple phrases, an irrevocable pathway, all sorts of things. But I think what they basically mean is they need the Israeli government as a matter of policy to say they support creation of a Palestinian state. They support a two-state solution. Now, at this point, I don't know which of those two things are harder, right? To get Netanyahu to support a two-state solution or to get Netanyahu to commit to a full Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. Both of those things seem brutally hard to me. And so that's why for the moment, it seems like discussion of normalization, much as Trump might want to press MBS on it this week, I don't think it's in the cards for the moment. I should add, when we got down to brass tacks, like if we ever got to the actual negotiation over this, and frankly, I hope we do at some point, it would be more than just that. I think it would be more than just an end to the war and an Israeli commitment to a two-state solution. There'd be a lot of nuts and bolts associated with strengthening the prospects for some kind of a Palestinian state.
I was just going to say to you that it's no longer seems no longer sufficient to me to come up with something that is essentially an articulation of a pathway. I mean, Netanyahu in 2009, in a Bar Ilan speech, agreed to a Palestinian state. He used the words constrained, while the Israelis are pursuing annexationist policies on the West Bank in everything but name, and probably in name, if there was an opportunity. I find it, almost unimaginable in this environment that the Saudis agree to anything less than what's articulated in the Arab Peace Initiative, which is it's a Palestinian state, right? 6-7 borders, capital in East Jerusalem. I mean, am I right or wrong on this?
I mean, what your key phrase is in this environment. I just don't see this happening at all in this environment. If we had a dramatically better environment, and it's going to take some time before we get to that point, then you would get down to a serious negotiation about the content. Now, I don't think the Saudis expect that they would demand everything. They certainly wouldn't demand, personally don't think they would demand creation of a Palestinian state tomorrow as a precondition for moving ahead. But they need enough there that suggests that that's the direction things are headed in.
Bernie?
Yeah, I think you have to distinguish between what the Saudis say in public and what they actually feel in private. So the normalization with Israel was never going to be a full-on normalization like you had with the UAE. It was going to always be staged and gradual, even if October 7th hadn't happened. October 7th did change their demands, that they became much more insistent on the end to the war in Gaza, as well as a pathway to a Palestinian state. But they also want Hamas to be destroyed, as they do want Hezbollah to be destroyed. So in that respect, they share kind of an Israeli point of view about both of these movements. The other thing I would say about them is that they want to see some acknowledgement of a Palestinian state, and they will begin to, as soon as there are negotiations, they will begin the normalization process. And so, in other words, it's not contingent on a final outcome, nor on specific conditions about what the Palestinian state would end up looking like. So what you said earlier, which is that, is it going to be fully sovereign, militarized, demilitarized? The Saudis are not interested in those details. That's for the Palestinians and the Israelis to decide, which effectively means that the Israelis have a veto over whatever Palestine looks like in the end.
Yeah. Well, we've reached the end of our 45 minutes. It's been a great one. I'll only conclude by saying that I think MBS is much more interested. He is interested in normalization with the U.S., but not with Israel right now. I want to thank both of you for sharing your wisdom, expertise, and authority. It was really a very good conversation. And for all you Carnegie Connects listeners, December 8th, I'll be sitting down with Senator Chris Van Hollen for a discussion of the fate and state of the American Republic, both at home and abroad, as we approach the end of 2025. I wish everybody well. Michael and Bernie, thanks again for participating. Be well and take good care.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.